Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our today's edition of the Media Understanding Mini Workshop. In fact, today's presentation is going to be part two of what happened 2 weeks ago. Was presented by Dr. Dora Sass from University of Chicago. Today we have Professor Anjali Adukia from University of Chicago and the director of the ME Lab. Am I saying it right? Messages, Identity, and Inclusion in Education Laboratory that Professor Adukia directs. And the topic of today's talk, again, focuses on representations and portrayals in books, in particular children's books, from images, text, and so on. Last week, we focused a lot on the visual aspects of the representation and the methodologies. Today, we'll extend this to the broader questions, and we are very, very excited to hear from Professor Adukia on these topics and the discussion that follows. A few words about Anjali. She is a professor in the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy and the director of the ME Lab, as I mentioned, and with a broad interest in sort of understanding both inequalities, that children face, from multiple sort of perspectives, and to see how we can create opportunities that can help children fully develop their potential. Right? So this is like a very broad calling, and her work has looked at various aspects of it, and today's sort of research sort of fits within that broad portfolio. Professor Adukia is got a degree from Harvard and University of Illinois at Urbana, and her work has been supported by many foundations and organizations, and she serves on both the boards of various journals as well as the National Bureau of Economic Research. So we are super excited today to hear from Anjali. Anjali, thank you for taking time. And today is also a special day, that the world observes the International Women's Day. Not just to which is a very dear a topic of equitable representations and portrayals and opportunities. So it's something that this group really cares about deeply. The Computational Media Intelligence Group at USC, jointly with the partners at the Media Understanding for Social Exploration at Google Research, which who are the hosts of this workshop. And and today it's a topic about children, and it fits very, very well in celebrating this and observing this too. Thank you so much, Anjali. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Can you see my screen by any chance? Okay, perfect. So yes. Thank you so much for having me and for that lovely introduction. It's an honor to be with you all virtually. And we were just saying, it's the nice thing about this is that, people can come from all over. And as Sri mentioned, my name is Anjali Adukia, and I'm at the University of Chicago. And, in my work broadly, I'm interested in understanding how to reduce inequalities such that all children have the opportunities to fully realize their potential. A lot of my prior work was actually based in India, where I had worked in NGOs. And when you tell people that you are working on education in developing countries, they often jump to, I know, let's give laptops to children. And, while children would often love to have laptops, the fact is that, they often face much more fundamental concerns, such as, related to safety and health and hunger. And so I became really interested in understanding how much further we could get if we really address these very basic needs, to be able to then think about, other needs. And so, but another fundamental need other than safety and health and whatnot is the notion of representation. If you don't see yourself represented in the world, or if you don't see others, how does that shape your beliefs? And so today I'm presenting work and with Alex Ebley from Columbia University, Emily Harrison, who's a PhD student here at the University of Chicago. She's amazing. Keep an eye out for her in a couple of years when she's on the on market. And then Hakizumwami Burali Renesha and Theodora Sass, who you met, Dora, a few weeks ago, and they're the computational scientists who, so Alex, Emily, and I really come at this from the social science side, and Hakizumwami and Dora come at it, from the computer science side. And so it's been a really nice collaboration. And before I begin, I also want to acknowledge the land on which I'm living and working in Chicago. In particular, we recognize the Council of the Three Fires. And so there's the Kickapoo, the Peoria, the Potawatomi, the Miami, and the Sioux. So the process of education itself and its associated books and curricular materials necessarily and by design transmits not only the values of society, but also whose space it is. But the inclusion and exclusion of different identities send messages which can contribute to how children view their own potential and the potential of others, which can then in turn shape subconscious defaults. And race and gender represent particularly salient identities, but it's really important to account for the intersection of multiple identities and experiences of exclusion and subordination. And there have been these calls for increased representation over time, but we don't really know, has this happened? How has it happened? Underlying this fundamentally is how do we even measure this systematically? So as many of you know, traditional content analysis, especially when you think about books, has involved people going page by page and doing this painstaking coding, where they code the images and the text, and you get very, very deep and complex representations in addition to simple representations. But the disadvantage is that it's extremely labor and resource intensive, and so it's necessarily slow. And just to back up in terms of what we think about what is representation, or how what do we mean when we say that? There's two different ways to think about it. One is whether people are present, and so it's more of like a numerical accounting of who's there. And then separately, it's how people are being portrayed, and it's like, are you really depicting one's humanity? And so, what's nice about traditional content analysis is you can get both the whether and the how. Separately, especially when people do content analysis, which in the social sciences has been underused, is really leveraging a lot of the advances in artificial intelligence over the years. So computer vision and natural language processing. And the nice thing is it doesn't matter if you're doing 5,000 pages or 5 million pages. Once you've done the upfront costs of really training your models and whatnot, it's just about having the actual materials digitized. The hard part is that it is much harder to measure complexity and nuance. And so thinking about how people are represented. And it's also important to remember that AI is only human, right? It necessarily reflects the biases of the humans that train the models and coded the data. But that's the case for all content analysis. And the nice thing about AI is that you can actually have many different humans with all of their biases code and train models, and then the model can actually, take advantage of all of those different perspectives. Whereas when you do traditional content analysis, it's much harder because it's an individual and you need, so many more individuals to do every single page. But it's important to also remember that these approaches are complementary. It's not that you can do all content analysis with only AI or only the traditional methods. And so, we need to think about how we can leverage the strengths of both of them in order to really understand what is actually being presented out there. And so in this, this is again, coming at it from a social science perspective. So, one thing that we really wanted to do is develop new tools that could convert images into data, that social scientists could use and, more systematically start to, incorporate into their research. So we are leaving a lot of data on the table by not at all taking, the information from images and using them alongside established text analysis tools that are there. And the way that we did it, at least initially, is that we're applying it to a century of award-winning children's books. And so these are books that have been recognized by the Association for Library Service for Children. And, they show up in children's lives in their schools and their homes. And, we wanted to look at three main sources of representation. Number one, we wanted to look at the construct of race. Now, race itself is this ill-defined, amorphous concept. And so, but it's a way of categorizing humans. And so the way that we are doing it is, number one, we're looking at skin color, from the youngest of ages. Children start to recognize differences in color, red and blue, but also different shades of brown. We'll also look at putative race. And what we mean by putative race is the racial classification that society essentially places on people. And so in the US, we think about, Asian and Black and, Latinx and white. And in other countries, there's different racial categorizations. And so, but we're going to be using, more of a US based framework here. And then we'll look at birthplace. And so, where one is born also has implications about how people categorize. Are you an immigrant? Are you from inside the US? Are you from, the West or whatnot? Separately, we're going to look at gender identity. And so, here we are binarizing gender. And so it is a limitation of the way that we are approaching this. And so it's really important, in future work to think about how to account for, non-binary and gender fluid identities. And would love to hear your thoughts about ways that we can actually do that more systematically. And then finally, we'll look at age. So whether people are younger or older. And then we're going to look at who is doing the representing. As I mentioned at the very, towards the beginning, is that, race and gender do represent very salient identities. But if we want to, account for an intersection of multiple identities and experiences of exclusion and subordination, but the question is, who does that? Who thinks about intersectionality seriously? And so, in these award-winning books, there are a set of awards that are more mainstream awards. They recognize books based on their literary value and not because of their popularity or because they're centering any particular identities. But separately, there's this other set of awards which specifically choose books because of how they are centering various experiences, because they are recognizing underrepresented identities. And so we want to understand, well, how are each of these collections essentially, or like who is being represented in these collections? And, even if one collection is intentionally recognizing one particular identity, are they more likely to account for intersectional portrayals? So what we see is that images are a really important data source, and there can be very, very cost-effective ways to incorporate these into our analyses. Pixel-based tools really mitigate a lot of the human bias in terms of classifying skin color. We talk a lot about the black and white, or the black and blue dress versus the white and gold dress, and this is one area where computers can do a much better job than humans. But as was talked about last time, even then, computers can be, again, they're reflecting the biases of the humans who coded them in the first place. And so there's still work that has to be done on that front. And we do see inequality in the representation of race, gender, and age on various dimensions. We see that mainstream books are more likely to show characters with lighter skin than books in the diversity collection, even when you hold race constant. So, characters who are classified as being Asian are more likely to be shown with lighter skin in the mainstream collection than in the diversity collection. And that's the case across all of the different racial groups. We see that children, regardless of collection, are shown with lighter skin than adults, which has potentially very concerning implications. And relative to their share in the US population, people who are Black or Latinx are underrepresented in images and in text. We also see that females are more likely to be represented in images than in text over time, which is consistent with the maxim that women should be seen more than heard. And this suggests that there may be symbolic inclusion in pictures without substantive inclusion in the actual story. And then males, especially white males, are more likely to be represented no matter the data source, whether you're looking at pronouns, other gendered words, character names, famous figures, geographic heterogeneity, or images. And then also one other thing that I don't have listed here is that in these books, you're actually much more likely to see adults featured than children, which is also very surprising in some ways because these are books that are targeted towards children. So you might expect children to be centered more, but even relative to their share in the US population, adults are centered. So I'll tell you a little bit more about the data. I'll go through our tools, some of the findings, and then really excited to discuss with everybody. So as I said, these are book awards that are featured by the Association for Library Service to Children. It's a division of the American Library Association, very influential group. And the mainstream collection are comprised of Newbery and Caldecott Awards. So Newbery Awards go back to 1920s, Caldecott's to 1930s. So, very old. They, I'll show you in just a moment, they're more likely to be checked out from libraries. We also see that they're more likely to be purchased, more likely to be searched for in terms of Google trends. And so just to give you a sense, so these are the set of book awards that we are looking at. The mainstream awards where we're always going to be depicting in terms of this pink. So again, they're the Newbery and Caldecotts. Now, up until 1970, only one author of color had ever received any of these awards. And so then in 1970, some people decided, well, we really need to be highlighting other identities. And so then came along the Coretta Scott King Awards, and they were specifically put in place to highlight the recognize books that highlight the African-American experience. And then a bunch of other book awards started to follow, the Stonewall, awards, which highlight now the LGBTQIA experience, the American Indian Youth Literature Awards, the Pura Belpre Awards, and whatnot. And so we call those and lump those into what we call the diversity collection. And so those are depicted by this darker blue. And then we actually break those up into smaller sub-collections to see, how different collections that highlight people of color or African Americans or people with disabilities, females or LGBTQIA individuals, how did they do in terms of representation? And in some ways, I think of, what we would see in this subset of books and that are recognized because they're centering underrepresented identities as almost an upper bound of the representation that you could expect to see in society. Because out of all of the books that are out there, these are the ones that have been selected by these groups. And these Caldecott and Newberys in particular are they rarely go out of print. They have largely become a part of the children's literature canon. What this is showing you here is so this is from Seattle Public Library checkout data. And in order to be eligible for the award, you have to have been published within the last year. So we limit the sample to books that had been published in the last year. And remember that this pink line represents mainstream book checkouts. The dark blue line are diversity book checkouts. And then this orange line are all other children's books. And what you see is that, and the Newbery and Caldecott Awards are actually announced mid to end January. And so this is centered at February 1st of the award year. And so, what you see is right around that time, there is this big uptick in terms of checkouts of these mainstream awards. And those daily checkouts persist over time. And actually, even if we extended this time frame further, you see that they are still more than twice as likely to be checked out than either those books that won any of these diversity awards or non-winning children's books over time. And so you see that it's really important to get into that black box of what are children learning? What are children being exposed to? So, separately, we're actually looking at textbooks in Texas. And when you look at the curriculum, a number of the novels and the books that are actually being given to kids are books that have been featured specifically by Newbery and Caldecott. So the way that we actually convert images into data is we start with, a digitized scan of each page in each book. And, this is actually a place where, especially people who think about this a lot, it would be wonderful to hear your feedback, because we're really focused right now on the face, but we want to get to characters. We want to get to, interactions between characters within an image and whatnot, but we wanted to start somewhere. And so, and even just detecting the faces turned out to be a bigger challenge than we expected, because the state of the art face detectors that are out there, specifically Google Vision API, has been trained on photographs, but over 80% of the images in these children's books are illustrations, and they have different poses and different colors, again, the blue robot or the green alien. So it's not just human pigmentation. And so we actually then had to train our own model on illustrations. And when we realized, Caldecott books, they are given to picture books specifically. And so when we first ran, a subsample of books, an FDGV, that's face detection using Google Vision, we actually got a very, very small number. I mean, there were just 8 faces that came out of this set of books. And we thought, okay, clearly there's something wrong. And so then once we actually trained our own model based on our own data set and using a publicly available iCartoon, we were able to detect many, many more many more faces. And so, that was step one of just, can we detect the faces? And then if we want to think about, okay, how do we get all pixels and actually classify what the skin color might be? So we started by segmenting the skin. So that's just isolating the skin from the rest of the face and any of the background to then be able to classify the skin color using a fully connected convolutional neural network. So that just gave us all the peripheral landmarks. And in this particular model, it actually cuts off the forehead. So it's, starting with the eyebrows, the edges of the face. It tells us where the eyes and the nose and the lips are. We then get a convex hull of those facial landmarks to give us just, a first face mask. But of course, there's some background. It's not quite perfect. So then we apply a conditional random field module continuously. So, in order to say, okay, from this pixel, we'll look at the pixels around, is that skin or not skin, skin or not skin, skin or not skin. And then that allows us to figure out, to really refine that face mask to give us the facial area of interest. But skin color it's an interesting question. What is one's skin color? Is my skin color what's being shown, from the highlights outside? Is it from the shadows? But really the skin color that people, the way we classify ourselves is this weighted average of everything that we're seeing. And it depends on the time of day and whatnot. And so, in order to account for this, we actually apply k-means clustering. And so, what that does is it partitions all of the colors into the k predominant colors. In our case, we're choosing 5, but you can obviously choose anything. And then we take a weighted average of those. And so just to explain what that means, we start with a face, we apply k-means clustering, where it clusters all those pixels into 5 groups. And then what we do is we actually drop the smallest 2 clusters, because what happens with this is the smallest 2 clusters typically are giving us the eyebrows and, the eyes and often the teeth and whatnot. And that's not the area that we're actually interested in. And so then what we do is we take a weighted average of these top 3 clusters, and then that gives us our, a value for every single face across the books. And then in this particular paper that I'm showing you today, we examine this perceptual tint distribution in 2 ways, either continuously, so, going from, 0 to 100, so that gives us this nice continuous measure, or by terciles. And so the way that we realized when we were having people manually code the faces just to try to understand, well, how accurate are the different models and whatnot. It's not that somebody would say, well, this is a skin, this face is 32 versus 48. And it was much more, people think about, is this darker? Is this medium? Is this a lighter skin? And so that's why we just, we took a very basic approach of just, let's break up the distribution into terciles. But as you saw with what Dora presented a couple of weeks ago, is that in other work, we are trying to take a more data-driven approach to account for the 3-dimensional nature of RG and B. And, in these images, there's 3 different skin color types that we see. there's human skin colors, there's monochromatic faces. So that's like black and white or sepia. And then there's the non-typical skin colors. So, the red rabbit or the green alien and whatnot. But we wanted to be able to separate these algorithmically. And remember that, so in each of these rows, maybe a little small to see is showing it for a different collection. So mainstream diversity, people of color, African-American, people with disabilities, female, and LGBTQIA. And, on the left is showing skin colors that have been, are darker versus lighter on the right. The y-axis is actually giving us the standard deviation of the RGB values of each face. So the higher the standard deviation, the more vibrant the color. But the closer the RGB values, the less vibrant the color. And so actually, that's how where we started. We started by saying, okay, how can we classify a face as being monochromatic? Because we realized that, the closer the RGB values were to each other, the more likely it was to be monochromatic. And so what we wanted to do was see, when is the standard deviation between these values less than a threshold T? And so what we did is we manually labeled a random sample of about 2,800 faces as either monochromatic or polychromatic. We then found the mean squared error between the predicted value, those predicted labels, using that equation for every integer value of T between 0 and 100. And then we averaged these mean squared errors over 1,000 bootstrap samples. And then what we found is that the threshold that minimized the mean squared error on average was a threshold of 13. And so then we actually used that threshold of 13 as what we actually considered to be monochromatic. So if it was 13 or below, then you were monochromatic, but if you were above, then you were polychromatic. So then that left us with, how do we then take apart the polychromatic faces into whether they're human skin colors versus non-typical skin colors? And in color theory, at least from our read, is that when that human skin color is often characterized by R is greater than G is greater than B. And so we use that very, very basic rule to then disentangle human skin colors from non-typical skin colors. And then you see, this is what we're left with. And so, you do see that over here, you're more likely to get the blues and the greens and the pinks. Here, you're more likely to get different shades of browns, some yellows, and, with monochromatic, you are more likely to get the, black and white and whatnot. And so that's where we're going to be I'll separately show you the results by these skin color types, but we also looked at it all together, and you'll see that actually the results are quite similar across each of these skin color types. There are challenges with skin segmentation as we're doing it. Sometimes we get partial faces or we only get hair. And so, that's going to lead to some measurement error. We have black and white photographs. So similarly, we look at them along that perceptual tint scale, regardless of whether they're polychromatic or monochromatic. And then we also have, the llama and, faces that are illustrated and are depicting some sort of artistic choice. And so, that's going to give us not perfect segmented skin, and then lead us to having different classifications. But once again, we are taking information from, are they depicted as lighter versus darker? And then separately, what we actually then say is, okay, let's use some existing feature classification models that are out there to be able to classify, race, gender, and age. And here we're actually using an AutoML model that was trained on photographs. This is the UTK face data set. And then in ongoing work, we're actually using the data set that we ourselves trained. And so, I like to tell social scientists in particular that every component of this pipeline represents an opportunity for further innovation and work. And in particular, this is where we love to collaborate with computer scientists and people who think about this seriously and, can help us make sure that we are, doing things in the best way possible, because, in some ways we feel like sometimes we're just making this up as we go along. And so, we're really excited to be talking with you all. Now, separately, we then use established text analysis methods to convert text into data. And so we start again with a digitized scan of every page in each book. We then use optical character recognition to convert the text in the page. And, there's so in order to get information, we first want to get all the name information. So we take all the unstructured text, we run it through NER, named entity recognition. And, there's two kinds of names. First, there are famous people who show up. And so there is this data set called Pantheon 2.0. And what they've done is they've actually scraped Wikipedia and run a model to identify famous people and characterize their gender, their birthplace, and their occupation. So we then match all of the unstructured text that comes out of this NER output, and Rosa Parks shows up. Great, we now know what her gender and her birthplace is, and we manually label the race because these are real people that we are more likely to be able to find. So then that gives us our initial gender and two race constructs for the famous people. Separately, there are also characters where you only know their first name. So Shri jumped over the fence, and Komal ran the marathon. And so what do we do with those individual names? Well, we take the remaining names that come out of the NER output. Now, the NER output gives you people, but it also gives you locations and currency and so many other things. So what we do is we take the first name and then we match to Social Security Administration data to predict the gender. So if Cameron comes out of it, then 91% of the people in the SSA data identify as male who are named Cameron. So then we tag that name as being male. But if the word that comes out is New Yorker, the new is the word that we're actually matching, and new doesn't actually match to SSA, so it gets thrown away. And so then that gives us, another, like a measure of gender for that first name. But separately, in terms of words, there's a whole set of tokens, and tokens are this, a string of characters, in our case, it's just a set of words that can give us information about gender. So pronouns such as she, her, his. There's other gendered words such as aunt or butler or nephew or queen. And so those can give us, female versus male. There's also nationality or ethnicity words. So Kenyan or Canadian or Mexican. Another way is thinking about just color words. It's very rudimentary. So, is the word black versus white mentioned, but these are children's books, so there might be lots of colors. So we also throw in blue or red just to see how different colors are potentially represented. And the way we get age is we actually take those gender words and we figure out like the age by gender. So girl or boy are younger words, whereas queen or king are older words. And so then that gives us, the measures of age. And so, then we have measures of race, gender, and age for both images, again, just looking at the faces, and for text. So I'll show you some of our results. So again, remember on the left-hand side, when you read this, it's showing you, so that the x-axis is showing you the perceptual tint. And so on the left side is darker faces, and on the right side is lighter faces. And remember that the pink is showing you for the mainstream books, or the distribution for the mainstream books, and the darker blue is for the diversity books. And what this is showing you is that the mainstream books are more likely to depict characters with lighter skin than the diversity collection is. And another way you could think about looking at this is in those terciles. And so we see that the diversity collection is more likely to have characters who are in the darker or medium skin terciles. But in the mainstream books, you are more likely to have certainly characters in the medium tercile, but also in the lighter tercile. Now, one way you could also think about extending this is saying, okay, well, how do these different sub-collections, collections that are focused on specific identities, how are they depicting characters? And so you would expect to see the collections that focus on people of color or African Americans, for them to actually have more characters within the darker and medium terciles. But what you might not expect is actually the collection that highlights females, the Rise Feminist Awards, that actually what we see there is they are much more likely to depict characters with darker skin. And actually, they don't have any characters in that lighter skin tercile, at least among human skin colors. So it does seem like they are more likely to account, for some intersectionality. What this is showing is these same terciles, but over time. And so, remember that the mainstream goes back to the 1920s, whereas the diversity doesn't start until the 1970s, which is why it's truncated here. And, you do see that the mainstream collection is more likely to show more characters in that darker skin tercile over time. There's been a surprising uptick also in lightness over the last 3 decades. But where they seem to have left off, in the most recent year is actually where the diversity collection started out in 1970. So, it does seem like that there has been change over time as well. And these patterns are very similar, whether you look at monochromatic skin colors that are depicted, or even if you look at these non-typical skin colors, you see that the mainstream books are still showing characters, even in non-typical skin colors, with lighter tints than the diversity collection on average. Something that was very surprising to us was, even when because you could say, well, maybe this is just because they're showing different races or whatnot. But even when you look within race, so what this is this is breaking. So remember in our when we're classifying faces, we not only classify the skin color, but we use a feature classification model to classify race, gender, and age. And so within a model that classifies characters as a given race, so taking this upper left-hand quadrant, for example. So this is showing the distribution of skin colors for characters that were classified as being Asian. And so it says that the mainstream collection is much more likely to show characters that are classified as Asian with lighter skin than the diversity collection is likely to show. And the diversity collection is likely to show those or characters that are classified as Asian with darker skin. And you see the same pattern for each racial classification, and also for characters that are monochromatic. And this is just an example, in both of these, all the characters have been classified as being Black, but you see that in the mainstream collection, these faces are much more likely to be highlighted or lightened, whereas in the diversity collection, it's more likely to actually show, the darker pigments. You see this sometimes for Martin Luther King, that in some of the books, they've actually added more highlights and whatnot. And so it does send a message that there is something different that's going on in these books that are being selected for these mainstream awards. We do see that regardless of the collection, that people who are white are more likely to be identified in the images in that feature classification model. And when you try to say, oh, well, what's going on there? Maybe there's something about gender. You actually see that female faces are quite present over time. Even going back to the 1920s, it's only the collections that highlight people with disabilities or females, which are above 50% or even above the share of females in the US population. And, when you actually look into it, you see, well, yes, so those women who are being portrayed are predominantly white women. And, the others are white men. Which is very surprising, because even in the collections, which highlight people of color, African Americans, or you would actually expect to see many more, women and men of color, but that doesn't seem to be the case. When you look at the famous people who are portrayed, so looking at the race and gender classifications of them, again, across all of the collections, white men are predominant, except the only place where they aren't the most likely to be represented is in the African American collection, but not even by a percentage point. So, Black males are more likely to show up than white males, but it's still quite similar. And in every single racial category, males are more likely to show up than females, within a given race for every single collection. Even the female collection, which is, again, not something you necessarily would expect because, they are books that are being recognized for highlighting females. When you look at who the actual people who are showing up, so this is just the top 10 appearances of famous people in the mainstream collection and the diversity collection. You see that in the mainstream collection, it's all males. You have to go down to number 16 before you get a female, and who's a white female, Eleanor Roosevelt. And you have to get all the way to number 43 before you actually get to a female of color, and that happens to be Rosa Parks. And even in the diversity collection, it is predominantly male, except for Rosa Parks, who's the one female who's being portrayed. And, I think something that's important to note is we are not saying anything about what's optimal. That is a philosophical question and depends on what it is that one's goals are and whatnot. But we do think it's important to have the information so that people can make an informed decision as to how do I want to be a social architect of all the books I'm putting on my child's shelves or in my classroom or whatnot. What some people like to know is they say, well, how does this compare to the share of, each population in the United States? So if that's a benchmark that you're interested in, then what you see here, so again, the share of whatever is in the column header, of that population in the US Census is shown in this orangish color, going back to the 1920s. And what you see is that relative to their share in the US population, historically, people who are Black have been underrepresented. That has changed in the last 2 decades. People who are Latinx in the mainstream collection have been continuously underrepresented, even though there is this increase in their population over time. So, the diversity collection has continuously included these individuals, but certainly not in the mainstream collection. And as I showed you earlier, it's really important to look at the mainstream collection because children are just so much more likely to be exposed to the messages in those particular books. And then people who are white, going back to the 1930s, have been overrepresented in the mainstream collection relative to their share of the population. So, again, take what you want from this, but it is interesting to know descriptively what that can look like. Separately, one way that people often categorize people is where you were born. And, the reason that this could be important is because it really does lead to otherism as well, that that's someplace else. Those are different people. There's protectionism or isolationism, or even notions about, who should be able to immigrate and whatnot. And so what we see in the mainstream collection, and so what this is showing you are the birthplaces of all the famous figures who show up in these books. And, what you see here is that the mainstream collection is much more likely to depict famous people who were born, especially on the eastern half of the United States, and a little bit on the western side, and in Europe, with a little bit of smattering around the world, but much more representation and geographic heterogeneity in the diversity collection. But when you break this down even further and you say, well, okay, who are the people who are actually being shown, around the world, and you break it up by gender, you see it's really not females as much as it is males. So most of the concentration of famous people who are not in the US or in Europe is actually coming from males who are being depicted. Separately, another way to look at this is by just token-based proxies for race. What are the percent out of all the words are nationalities or ethnicities being mentioned? And so you see more within the collections that mention or that highlight people of color, or the diversity collection. Another way is just saying, well, let's use color words. And so what about mention of Black or Blacks or whites or blue or blues? And you do see more mention of, Black or white in the collections that are highlighting people of color, and not really blue or even red in these books. So, just as a very rudimentary check on things. So then another way to just say, okay, let's just look at the text in terms of, gender and who's being represented. So the way to read this is 0% is saying 0% of females or female words as a percent of all gendered words. And again, remember the way that we're measuring gender is there's 4 different categories. There's pronouns, other gendered words, so queen, king, girl, boy, character names, and famous figures. And so we're combining them all here. And so 0% means that there's none, 100% means that there's 100% female words. And what you see is that the mainstream collection is much more male-centered than the diversity collection is overall. Now, I said that we don't say there's nothing that we're not taking any stand of what's optimal. What you might expect to think is, or what you might expect as being an upper bound is the female collection. You might expect that to be more female centered than any other collection because again, they're selecting on that. And so this is actually showing it for each collection. And indeed, you do see that the female collection is shifted over to the right. So it is more female centered, but it is less female centered than the mainstream collection is male centered. And so, again, just thinking about what that proportionality is and what people might feel is expected in this female collection. In fact, overall in the female collection, the most mentioned figure is actually John F. Kennedy, so it's clearly not a female. And so, there is something going on there that whoever is writing those books or recognizing these books, that there is this feeling of like, we need to do more balancing. Whereas in the mainstream, there isn't that same set of pressures. This is just showing the share of female words over time. So you do see that there has been this increase, in the mainstream collection and in other collections where it's only the female collection that's ever above 50% or above the, share of females in the US population. So some people might say, but, when I was growing up, he was the new gender neutral pronoun. So of course you're going to see more male centered words because they're just using a lot of he's. So fine, you might expect to see that with pronouns, but then we say, but you shouldn't expect to see that in terms of other specific tokens. So, the queen, the king, girl, boy, you shouldn't expect to see that with character first names or famous figures. But regardless of the measure, you see that the only measure where it's over 50% is the female collection, whereas all the other collections are below 50%. The one thing that where you don't actually see that it's, but where you don't actually see the same pattern. So this famous figure measure is actually saying, let's say Rosa Parks shows up 3 times in a given book. Well, she gets a value of 3 in that. But you could also say, well, what about the unique famous figures that are actually mentioned, where it's like, okay, she may show up 3 times, but she gets a value of 1. So this is actually showing what that looks like in terms of the share of unique famous females. And here you actually see that not even a third of the famous people, the individual famous people who are mentioned in the female collection are actually females. So that means that more than 2/3 are males. And, we actually went and coded to make sure, well, how many are actually, a part of the LGBTQIA community, and no one in this entire collection was. It was in the LGBTQIA collection, it was only 2 individuals who actually I don't remember the exact, but it was a very, very small proportion who identified as non-binary. That's right, because we were trying to understand what might be an upper bound in terms of what we might expect to see. So what this is showing you is we wanted to think about or start thinking about how is it that images and text relate to each other. So here the y-axis is showing us female faces as a percent of all faces. And then the x-axis is female words as a percent of all gendered words. We already showed you that they are, less than half as likely to show up in images and in text. Each dot represents the decade or a different decade for each collection. That's why mainstream has more dots than anybody else. And here what this is showing you is that females are more likely to be represented in images than in text over time, which is consistent with the maxim that women should be seen more than heard. And this suggests that there may be symbolic inclusion in pictures without substantive inclusion in the actual story. Here, what I'm showing you is just the breakdown by age. So the purple is showing adults who show up in images, and the green is showing children. You see that adults are much more likely to show up in images than children are. What we're showing here is for text. The upper two figures are younger female words or younger male words. So girl versus boy, and down below are older female or older male words. So mother or father, for example. And again, you see that, older people are much more older words, older gendered words are more likely to show up than younger words. And, again, someone might say, but there are more adults than there are children. But even relative to their share in the US population, adults are overrepresented in both the mainstream and the diversity collection. So actually, one thing that could be very interesting is that these books or these awards are, the selection committees comprise adults. And so you could imagine actually looking to see which are the books that children might select in their particular awards. Is it that children are more likely to center children in terms of what they choose? I think this is the figure, though, that I think gave me the most pause, to be honest. And I think really highlighted something very pernicious that seems to be going on. And so remember that the green is showing the distribution of children who are depicted. The purple is depicting adults. And in every single collection, we see that children are more likely to be depicted with lighter skin tones than adults are. And the reason this really concerns me is because we live in a society where we equate youth with innocence. And in this case, it seems like we're equating innocence with lightness or whiteness. And, we really treat Black children as older than they are. And you think about what are the implicit and explicit messages if we are depicting, youth with lightness, for example, or innocence with lightness. And, I think it's an empirical question, and whether you look at it continuously or you look at it in terms of percentages of in that by tercile, in every single collection, children are more represented than adults in that, in the lighter skin tercile. And, there's not a biological reason why this should be the pattern. And in some ways you think, what happens to melanin as you get older is it's more likely to break down. And so actually that's why people talk about, when you're old, you're pasty and white and whatever, but it's actually just there, you may be more likely to actually become lighter as you get older. Separately, you could say, well, maybe there are more mixed race kids. And so therefore, you're going to see lighter skin colors, but that doesn't go back to the 1920s. And they're not, it's not, that doesn't seem to be, it doesn't seem as plausible that would be the reason why we would systematically see this, even over time. And, it could be that people are spending more time working outside or something like that so that they get skin tan. But regardless, we shouldn't expect to see systematic differences. And, this difference is statistically significant whenever you look at, the differences in terms of the averages. We see that this is very cost effective. We had done a lot of hand coding. This is just one exercise, just again, trying to encourage social scientists to really try to take this seriously and think about how can we, really leverage a lot of the advances in AI to, analyze content. And the more people who get involved, the cheaper and the better these tools are going to be, right? They're not perfect. There's a lot of problems in terms of who gets classified and how and whatnot. And so I think the more people who get into this, the better it's going to be for everybody. So, we see that images are a really important data source, and, ML tools, machine learning tools can really help to mitigate some of the biases that humans bring to the table, especially when classifying skin color. One of our hopes is that, at least software tools that we've developed and in collaboration with anyone, that we can actually make it more open source and available for not only researchers to use, but, when we started with this, we had this dream that, a third grade teacher could take all of their materials and run it through some sort of pipeline and figure out what is the representation. But the fact is the digitization of all of the materials ended up being a really big chunk of time. And so actually, it seems like if we could actually get publishers at the source, they already have everything, they have everything in digital form. The text is separated from the images. It would be much easier to run things through some sort of pipeline. And you could imagine them producing some sort of awareness card or metric or something to say, oh, in this book, this is, the representations that's there in this book. And so, for all the full catalog, not only what are the topics that are potentially being, available for children, but also what is the representation. And people could ignore the information, but at least we give that information. And what we also see is that in these really, really influential books, which, to be clear, Newbery and Caldecott's, many people think of as tools of the elite liberals, and that they're already very, progressive and whatnot. And yet, even in this, we do see a lot of inequality. The fact that characters are more likely to be depicted with lighter skin in these mainstream books than in diversity books, even after conditioning on race. And, the fact that children are shown with lighter skin on average than adults, and that, even now, people who are Latinx or, people who are Black are underrepresented. And, if you're showing females, or if you're more likely to show females in images than in text, potentially just including them symbolically rather than substantively, what are those messages that are also being sent? And that there is the males, and especially white males, just seem to be much more likely to be represented no matter what the data source is. So whether you're looking in images or in text. So I will stop there. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Angela. It's fascinating. So much to just take in, in terms of your results and, the interpretation. It's just fascinating sort of body of work of yours and the colleagues. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I have a few questions, but I'm going to open it up to all people that are still here. Please feel free to sort of, if you don't mind, turn on your camera for asking questions or discussion items, or put it on the chat if you don't feel like it. That's also all right. So the floor is open. Well, if people are collecting their thoughts, then I can ask, maybe I'll start just to give people some time. So one question, these are some nitty-gritty details that I was curious about. In your analysis of these illustrations, the visuals, right, across collections and within collections, right, how did you, normalize for sort of variability in how these illustrations were portrayed so that you can have a common frame of comparison? Do you know what I mean? So a particular illustrator within
so we don't. So I think so the way that you could imagine, the most that you can imagine is when you look at the results over time, then you can imagine the technology that is available to somebody, in 1952 is also available to the other authors in 1952 as well, or by that decade. And so, but certainly there could be differences that if you have a publisher that's better resourced than I do or something. So there we are not actually doing any kind of corrections at this point. So, but if you have ideas of ways that we should be totally open to hearing them.
Yeah, because, one thing that was striking in your kind of laying out this sort of human-like skin tone, color, illustrations versus sort of these more monochromatic type of, more grayscale or some other sort of monochromatic scale. And it's interesting to see how the illustrators or the way they depicted it within a collection, because these are images that are given and not necessarily photographs, probably, right? I don't know. How many of these were live photographs versus actually illustrations, that is paintings or cartoon?
Right. I don't remember. So I know about, at least in a manually coded sample that we did, over 80% were illustrations. but among those, I don't remember how many are monochromatic, but actually I don't remember what the breakdown was.
And a related nitty-gritty, since I'm on the nitty-gritty
I love it.
kind
That's
of thing.
great.
Yeah, this one, kind of the trends were amazing, right? Like, I was wondering, what were across these various collections, what were the absolute numbers and the statistical sort of significance of some of these comparisons that you were showing us, because, even within a particular category of diversity or mainstream or even subcategories, maybe are the ends balanced, or how were the statistics?
Yeah. So certainly for the difference between children and adults in terms of skin color, that is statistically significant. I think most of the differences that we showed, so when you look at, light skin versus, or like lighter versus darker, so when you compare mainstream or diversity, those distributions definitely vary. They are statistically distinguishable from zero. The differences between like males and females, I think in most of them, the differences were significant. So certainly, though, I guess if you look, the people of color collection, however, is highly correlated with the African American collection, because the Coretta Scott King Awards are a part of the people of color collection. And so there is, this correlation across like the sub collections in particular. So in some ways, that's why we often have like the mainstream versus diversity, because those encompass all the collections together.
So others, please jump in. Como.
Yeah, I can ask a few questions. So Anjali, thank you very much for the talk. It was so fascinating to see some of your findings and insights. And like you, I agree. I too paused when I, read that children are depicted with lighter skin tone compared to their ancestors. And I wonder what kind of messages we're sending out. But a few questions about the methodology. So, or the techniques you used. You mentioned you trained your own model for face detection using AutoML. And I was curious, is that because some of the Google Vision APIs were underperforming on illustrations?
So underperforming, yes. And in fact, that's where in just like a subsample of Caldecott books, the Google Vision only identified 8 faces, whereas when we trained our own, it was, I think, hundreds. So
were these
go ahead.
I was going to ask, were these images were digitized already available from the pages in the books, or how the pipeline, how were the documents presented to the algorithms?
Sorry, I didn't.
These illustrations are usually probably contained within a page, right, with text and so on. Were they segmented? The images were pulled out separately, or were they given as part of the text document?
Yeah. So actually, this is where I wish Dora were here, because we tried it in many different ways. I know that we tried CBIR. We tried running it through. I think in the end that we just ran it through as is, and at least as the first pass in terms of our first set of findings, just because, especially trying to bring this into the social sciences literature, if we went too far down the path, then in some ways, like, we're not actually bringing things in stepwise as well. But I know that we had talked about separating things based off of, trying to partition the pages and whatnot. So, but I don't remember in these which one we're actually using.
I'll move back to you.
Yeah. So Anjali, you also mentioned, like, machines are better at identifying pixels. And I'm wondering, what were your thoughts on training your own classifier or AutoML model for skin tone detection versus, using like k-means clustering?
Yeah. So that's where I don't, so what Dora had presented last time was us trying to train and go down the path of training our own classifier to say, is this darker, is this medium, is this lighter? And I think we need both depending on the context, because even the notion of what's dark versus light it really mattered who our coders were. So, one of the people on our team, born and raised in India, and everybody had light skin basically, other than a few people who had medium skin, whereas people who were born and raised in the US had different thoughts about, well, who might be dark or medium or light. And separately we're doing this project in South Asia right now, actually on photographs, and there we are going to have to think more carefully about, like, well, how do we train a classifier to say what tercile you might be placed in or not. And so, so we think that it's useful to think about, and even here right now we're using k-means and we're averaging across those, the three partitions. But really what we could also just do is just take all of the pixels and just average across the pixels themselves. So
I think Cree may have some questions. Cree, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for the talk, Anjali. It was really, really a lot of interesting data there to cover in a short amount of time. My question was, you mentioned that you guys trained a model to classify the race of characters in the books, and if I understand correctly, that was based just on the face detection results essentially. And so, kind of curious if you can speak to the sort of issues that might arise there. Like, I guess one question I had was like, how you're collecting the data to train that model. Are the raters actually, be able to use more context from the story, for example, to try to understand the race of the characters, and like how well you think you can actually classify race just from appearance in an ML model?
I think terribly, to be honest. I think that this is, I think if there is anything that's really, really weak, it's that feature classification side of things. I mean, whether it's race, gender, or age, to be honest, and the inner rater reliability across our manual labelers is pretty bad, I think. I mean, it's not very high. I think it's like 66%, or depending on what the feature is. Sometimes it's 76%, somebody it's 78%, but it's not clear that even the humans agree on like how you categorize these different faces. And right, for what we're using here is actually the UTK face data set. So it's a publicly available data set where they've actually labeled, they already have like a labeled data set that we brought in. But frankly, even that data set is not, I mean, there are many problems in there. And so, that's why when we look at, for example, that one, the results when we hold race constant, but then look at the skin color distributions, the thing is that even though I think that the classifier is really not good, it's still classifying the faces in mainstream books the same way it would classify faces in diversity books. And so it's still interesting to know within a given race, like within a set of faces that are classified as a given race, how are they being depicted in terms of skin color? And so, if indeed, people who are real people like Martin Luther King or Rosa Parks are having their skin colors lightened, maybe to make it more appealing to the median reader or something, who knows why? But if that's the case, then that's also a concern in and of itself. But would love to hear your thoughts about better ways to classify features and to get information. And so this is something where we really do want to do something more cross-modal or multimodal, where we take information from the text to give us information about the images themselves, because it's true, just taking a little just a picture of a face doesn't necessarily give you enough information about how a person identifies and what their background is and whatnot. So I think there's a long way to go on that side of things. So that's why I'm much more, I feel better about the skin color classification side of all of this, because it's really just pixel based and just thinking about perceptual tint. And there, I think, we can talk a lot about, well, what are different ways, like, should we be using CIA Lab? Should we be using some other kinds of color spaces and whatnot? But these feature classification models, it feels very much like a black box that I don't understand everything that's going on inside of them. So I don't have a ton of confidence in those results for sure.
It's just an open thought. I'm just thinking out loud here as I'm listening to this discussion, right? On the depictions, right? Say in a particular book, so we have depictions of several people, individuals, right? And so if we look at them intersectionally, so based on whatever pieces of information along the dimensions that you have, right, about their, especially for when it's known, such as people like, Abe Lincoln or Rosa Parks, or people that have been, and then within a particular book, right, is when I was thinking about this calibration, right, is the relative sort of depictions, how are they shown in this terms of, these relative, say, skin tone sort of portrayals, is lighter, darker, medium, or is there something that is more from an absolute, way that mapping these pixels is what is done? So that's what I was getting at. Like, are they the intended? So what was intentionally done by the illustrators or the depictors in providing sort of these representations and the overall trends, which is also sort of interesting, right? What are they based on? Do you have any sort of insights on that?
Yeah, so I guess, again, I don't know what people typically do, but one thing that we've thought about is, could we get pictures of Rosa Parks or Martin Luther King or a lot of these famous people? And as you said, see, well, how far off, are the illustrators, or what direction do they go? The problem for a lot of this is most of the pictures for at least historical figures are black and white. So we don't actually have good color images of people. And then also it did depend on the lighting, and so much of the photography isn't great for people of color, over time. So it's unclear, is that really giving us the correct depiction in the first place? But I mean, we could try to say, at least based off of what we can get from Google searches, or, what we can try to create some sort of ground truth, and then see, okay, what direction do people go in terms of these really famous people, like the top mentioned people? Yeah, it would be a great idea.
Yeah. Hi. Yeah. Thank you for the talk. I really liked it, especially the various graphs that you showed. It was really very appealing. So first of all, I wanted to ask, so when you do the text analysis, so did you only count the mentions of, let's say, the age or gender words, or were we also trying to connect them back to the characters mentioned in the book? So is it per mention based, or is it per character?
It's per mention in this. Separately, we also are doing word embeddings and sentiment analysis and whatnot, just to see how different characters are talked about, or how gender or race is portrayed. But in this, we aren't connecting. If it says she, we don't necessarily know, oh, you're talking about Eleanor Roosevelt, or oh, you're talking about Jennifer who's walking down the street. So there's not that kind of connection, not yet.
Another thing I wanted to ask, so this is a more technical question. So since we are comparing different trends with each other, or different subparts of the larger corpus with each other, so did we correct for the multiple comparisons, or apply any Bonferroni correction to the statistical analysis, or do you think that doesn't apply here?
I mean, here what we're showing, we're really just showing descriptives, you know, so this is not, there's no causal inference here. There's no, we're not really testing for anything in particular. I mean, we are looking to see, okay, you know, is this distribution different than this distribution? Does it look like it's statistically different? Okay, we can see that, but we're not testing, you know, to see, well, do all of these things, or does, you know, does this and this and this cause something else? And so, you know, it's not something which in this we are not, but certainly it would be important that if we were trying to understand, you know, how these all might be beliefs or outcomes and whatnot, I think we need to be doing some sort of multiple hypothesis testing and whatnot. So this is really just, in fact, we didn't even anticipate this to be a paper in and of itself. We just thought we're going to try to figure out what these methods are, these tools are, to be able to apply them to, you know, some of the other projects that we want to do. And then we just realized, wow, these are really interesting patterns. And, you know, just even getting the tools themselves, like there's not one way to go about, you know, applying some of these methods. And so let's just start the conversation, and you know, in conjunction with computer scientists who have been thinking about this for a long time. So
okay, and last thing from my side, so do you think that it'd be more interesting to like compare the trends that you observed with, let's say, general literature, like how do those word frequencies changed not only in children's books, but children's books compared to, let's say, other like general novels and books or news articles, etc.
Yeah, so when we do word embeddings and we use histwords, for example, histwords, which goes back over the last 100 years or more than 100 years, you know, in terms of that, and that's like all, you know, that's adult books and, you know, a much larger corpus that, and so, you know, I don't actually know if there are good data sets which could give us, so the histwords, for example, doesn't give us counts of all the gendered words, and, you know, and so we don't know over time the counts, but we know the word embeddings, for example. So if you all know of other sources of where we should get to be able to see, well, how does this look in terms of other collections, that would be great. Separately, we thought about, we could collect or try to scrape, you know, all the covers of the New York Times or all the, you know, some sort of news source. But there are a lot of restrictions now in terms of what you're allowed to scrape and use for research purposes. And so we've actually really run into a number of barriers on that front, because there are a lot of restrictions that these, and so we thought, even in terms of images, wouldn't it be nice to have some sort of sense of, we don't know what the distribution in the population is of skin color, and we have no idea how to get that. So we thought, well, maybe we can get Getty images over time, or maybe we could scrape, you know, Google images, you know, for these particular categories over time. And, you know, Getty, for example, will not allow that. Like it is just, it's prohibited, you know, under any license. And so, or if I think if you buy it, then it's extremely expensive. So I think part of the problem for us has just been a data issue, but, you know, if you all have ideas, we welcome them for sure.
Sure. Thank you.
Thanks.
Questions? I have one more, if that's okay. So in the collections that you analyzed, right, like there were certainly ones that were focused on famous historical figures and other famous people, right? So about whom there's publicly available knowledge about these dimensions of, you know, based on race and sort of an expected, you know, skin tone, etc. How many of those were just fictional characters, and where these kinds of descriptions or attributes mentioned or just left there without any mentions, right? It's not disclosed explicitly because it was not central or part of the storytelling that was happening. So do you have any sort of, you know, insights on how those compared? Like, you know, so these famous historical figures in these award-winning or collections of both the diversity and mainstream, and ones that are just characters like.
So you're asking what's the difference in terms of how famous people are talked about versus like other characters?
Characters, and then how many of those attributes are even available for sort of auditing, right? Like we are doing, because they may not have explicitly specified their age or their perhaps gender, etc.
Yeah, so I think that's where we really rely in terms of like the fictional characters on information such as name. So, and being able to connect it to the SSA database, or, you can't really infer race very well in terms of names. And, certainly there might be some, but it performs pretty badly, which is why we don't actually apply some of the existing model or like existing techniques that people use for first names. So we just get gender from the first names of characters. But, in terms of like when we do word embeddings, we can look at gender of just gender generally. We can look at it just for like non-famous mentions, and then we can look at famous mentions. And the patterns are actually really similar. So we see that females are more likely to be associated with family, or appearance, whereas males are more likely to be, associated with business or power. People who are Black, like famous people who are Black, are much more likely to be associated with struggle and not joy, for example. Whereas, white men can be associated with anything. And so white females are more likely to be associated with the performing arts. And so you do see these patterns. And overall, females are, even famous females are more likely to be connected to their appearance, for example. And over time, males and females are converging in terms of how they're talked about in terms of the family, but it certainly started out where females were more likely to be. So, so there is, I'm sure that there are differences that we just haven't picked up yet. And one thing that we're not doing, per the other question, is connecting the she with Rosa Parks. So right now they are looked at as different entities altogether. So
co-references.
Yeah.
So on that note, right, what are your your big wish list for computational scientists, in these lines? What is
so many. So many. I mean, the work that you all are doing is really just so inspirational and so exciting. And it would be nice to think about how can we systematically connect these different sources. So, when kids read a book, sure, at first the pictures are really, they speak 1,000 words, as they say, right? That they are getting a lot of information, but eventually they are learning from both. And it's not just looking at the text or just looking at the images, they are speaking to each other. So to figure out how we can characterize that relationship and systematically do so, to then be able to measure these things would be really great. And I want to push much further on how people are being portrayed, not just whether they are being portrayed, because you can have a book full of characters with underrepresented identities, but if they're being portrayed in stereotypical or reductive ways, then, we're not really getting where we want to. So that how piece is just critical, but it's hard, and I get it. And but it's not, I think it's not insurmountable, and people are making progress. And it would just be nice for those people who are working on that technical side of things, we would be delighted to partner accordingly, because it seems like there's a lot of really interesting questions out there. Think about villains and heroes, and, is there a way that we can characterize even the features that are given to villains systematically versus heroes? And what are those messages? And again, connecting images and text, for example. And I think there's a number of different directions that would be super fun to talk about.
Thank you so much for that. I think that's lots of work to do for everyone, right?
Thank you all so much for having me. This was wonderful.
Thank you so much, Anjali. This was fascinating work and fascinating talk, and very, very thought-provoking. And thanks to everyone for being here on behalf of the Muse team at Google and the CCMI at USC. Thank you again. So hope we get to all work together. Yeah.
Sounds wonderful. Thank you all.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Take care.